There are still places on Earth that do not look entirely real. Places where the land feels older than memory, where fog can swallow a coastline for days, where entire villages seem to be slipping back into the mountain, the forest, the stone, and where time has shaped the world so slowly and so completely that what remains can feel almost impossible. Some of these places were carved by fire, some by water, some by pressure, collapse, erosion, and silence over millions of years, and some were touched by human hands so long ago that nature has nearly taken them back. But what makes them unforgettable is not just how strange they look, it is the feeling they leave behind. Because in places like these, the world stops behaving the way we expect it to. The familiar begins to feel distant, scale becomes hard to measure, and the line between history, geology, and myth starts to blur. In this film, we travel across deserts, mountains, islands, forests, ruins, and coastlines to find places that challenge the way we see the planet itself, not because they are fantasy, but because they are real. And that may be the strangest part of all. Angel Falls, where the sky breaks open. In southeastern Venezuela, deep inside Canaima National Park, there is a waterfall that does not seem to fall so much as disappear out of the sky. The world knows it as Angel Falls, but it is also known as Kerapakupai Meru, an indigenous name still used in the region. It descends from Oyan Tepui, one of the park's flat-topped table mountains, in a landscape so unusual that UNESCO describes the Tepuis as a unique biogeological world of their own. The park itself stretches across roughly 3 million hectares, and about 65% of it is covered by these towering mesas and sheer cliffs. What makes this place feel almost unreal is not only its height, though the numbers are staggering. Angel Falls drops 979 meters with an 807-meter uninterrupted plunge, making it the highest waterfall on Earth. That kind of scale is hard to picture until you see what the air does to the water. For much of its descent, the falling river loses its solidity. Wind catches it, light breaks through it, and before it ever reaches the ground, part of it has already turned to mist. From a distance, it looks less like a river and more like a white veil drifting off the edge of another world. And that is really the key to this place. Angel Falls does not feel theatrical. It feels ancient. The cliff does not present itself like a stage. It stands there like something older than the idea of an audience. The surrounding rainforest, the winding rivers below, the isolated Tepui walls rising out of the Guiana highlands, they create a sense of scale that makes people feel very small, but not in a cruel way, more in the way a cathedral can. You are dwarfed, yes, but also quieted. The famous name came from Jimmy Angel, the American aviator who flew over the falls in the 1930s and later crash-landed his plane on the mesa above. But the place was never truly discovered in the deeper sense of that word. Long before it entered global imagination, this landscape already belonged to the memory and worldview of the region's indigenous communities. UNESCO has noted the deep spiritual and cultural ties the Pemon people maintain with the Gran Sabana and the Tepui landscape, and that matters here. It changes how you see the falls, not as an isolated spectacle, but as part of a living geography of meaning. So when you look at Angel Falls, you are not just looking at water dropping from a cliff. You are looking at height, yes, at geology, at distance, at a place shaped by rain, stone, and time. But you are also looking at one of those rare landscapes that still resists easy ownership, a place the modern world can name, measure, and photograph, and still not fully explain. Ellora Caves, a mountain cut into memory. Some places amaze you by what was built there. Ellora amazes you by what was taken away. In the state of Maharashtra, western India, the Ellora Caves stretch for more than 2 kilometers along a basalt escarpment. What visitors see today is not one monument, but a vast rock-cut complex of 34 caves, monasteries, temples, halls, courtyards, shrines, created across several centuries. UNESCO dates the earliest Buddhist caves to roughly the 5th to 8th centuries, the Hindu group mainly to the 7th to 10th centuries, and the Jain group to the 9th to 12th centuries. What makes Ellora so unusual is not only its scale, but the fact that Buddhist, Hindu, and Jain monuments stand together in one continuous sacred landscape. That matters for a video like this, because Ellora is not strange in the way a volcano or a waterfall is strange. Its power comes from something more human. It shows what a civilization can leave behind when faith, patience, engineering, and artistic ambition all work at the same scale. This is not ruin in the casual sense. It is endurance carved into stone. Even now, more than 1,000 years later, the place still feels less like an archaeological site than a physical argument against the idea that human work must be fragile. And then there is Kailasa Temple, Cave 16, the part of Ellora that seems to stop people in their tracks. It is widely regarded as the site's masterpiece, a massive temple dedicated to Shiva, carved from a single mass of rock rather than assembled block by block. Archaeological Survey of India materials attribute it to Rashtrakuta King Krishna I in the 8th century, while standard reference works note that most scholars generally place its main creation in that period. What is most astonishing is the method. Rather than building upward, the artisans are understood to have cut downward from the top of the rock, removing enormous quantities of stone until columns, stairways, sculptures, walls, and open courts gradually emerged from the mountain itself. Britannica notes estimates of roughly 150,000 to 200,000 tons of rock removed. That detail changes the way you see it, because once you understand that Kailasa was not constructed but revealed, the whole site begins to feel different. Every pillar becomes an act of restraint. Every sculpture becomes a decision not just about what to shape, but what to leave standing. In American terms, we often think of great monuments as feats of assembly. Bridges, cathedrals, skyscrapers, dams. Ellora belongs to another tradition entirely. It is architecture by excavation, creation by subtraction, and that makes it feel, even now, faintly impossible. There is also a deeper cultural force here. Ellora is one of those rare places where spiritual history is visible not as abstraction, but as geography. Buddhist caves with monasteries and prayer halls, Hindu temples with epic relief sculpture, Jain sanctuaries marked by a different visual rhythm and philosophical world. They were not made all at once, and they did not erase one another. They accumulated. That is part of what gives Ellora its emotional weight. It does not present India as a single, fixed tradition. It reveals a longer, layered civilization, one in which beliefs changed, overlapped, and still left space for neighboring forms of devotion. So after Angel Falls, where nature seemed to break open the sky, Ellora gives us a different kind of wonder. Not the power of water, not the violence of geology, but the almost unsettling patience of human hands. A mountain was not simply cut here, it was persuaded to remember. Skeleton Coast, where the land refuses rescue. There are coastlines that welcome ships, and then there are coastlines like this one, along northwestern Namibia. The Skeleton Coast stretches through one of the harshest meeting points on Earth, where the Namib Desert runs straight into the Atlantic, and the shore is often wrapped in fog generated by cold offshore currents. Britannica describes the coast as frequently foggy and humid for exactly that reason, even though fresh water is scarce almost everywhere beyond the Cunene River. The result is a place that feels deeply contradictory, wet in the air, dry in the ground, and never quite willing to become hospitable. What made the Skeleton Coast feared was not one dramatic danger, but several quiet ones working together. The surf was heavy, visibility was poor, and once a ship was forced ashore, survival did not necessarily improve. Because behind the beach lay one of the driest landscapes in Africa. That is why this coast became associated with wrecks, abandonment, and human helplessness. Even today, Namibia's Environment Ministry presents the park as a remote wilderness marked by shipwrecks, bird life, and an extreme desert environment, rather than as a comfortable seaside world. And yet this place is not empty. That is part of what gives it its power. The broader park protects wildlife that sounds almost improbable in a setting like this. Desert-adapted elephant, lion, cheetah, Hartmann zebra, oryx, dolphins, turtles, and hundreds of bird species are all recorded in the protected area. In the neighboring Namib system, UNESCO has emphasized something even more remarkable. This is a fog desert, and life here has evolved around that fact. In other words, the same fog that once confused sailors also helps sustain specialized ecosystems. On this coast, survival does not come from abundance. It comes from adaptation. That is what makes the Skeleton Coast feel so unsettling on screen. It is not loud in the usual sense. There is no need for spectacle. The dunes, the gray air, the wrecked metal, the cold sea, the sense of distance, together they create something more severe than beauty and more patient than violence. It feels like one of those places where the world has been stripped down to first principles: wind, sand, salt, hunger, endurance. Not a landscape that invites settlement, but one that tests whether anything can remain at all. So after Ellora, where human hands carved meaning into stone, the Skeleton Coast shows us the opposite truth. Some places do not preserve human ambition. They outlast it, and in Namibia, on this fog-bound edge of Africa, the land and the sea seem to say the same thing in different languages. You may arrive here, but that does not mean you belong. Oradour-sur-Glane, the village that was left untouched. Not every strange place unsettles us because of geology. Some do it because history never truly left. In central France, Oradour-sur-Glane looks at first glance like a village suspended in silence. Rusted cars, cracked stone walls, sewing machines, Bicycles, door frames, tram tracks. Ordinary things remain where life once moved around them. But this is not a ruin shaped by time alone. It is a place deliberately preserved because of what happened here on June 10, 1944, when troops of the 2nd Waffen-SS Panzer Division Das Reich massacred 642 people and burned the village. The official Memory Center describes Oradour as a martyr village, and the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum notes that after the war, France declared the site a national memorial and ordered its conservation. That is what gives Oradour its particular emotional force. The village was not rebuilt on top of its own destruction in the usual way. Instead, the ruins were kept, almost as a physical refusal to let the event be softened by distance. In American terms, it carries some of the weight of a battlefield, a memorial, and a crime scene all at once. You are not looking at the idea of tragedy. You are looking at the space where daily life was interrupted and never resumed. The Memorial Center today exists not just to guide visitors through the ruins, but to help explain the ideological logic that led to the massacre. The facts are brutal, and because they are brutal, the place needs restraint rather than embellishment. The SS rounded up the inhabitants, separated the men from the women and children, confined them in different buildings, and then killed them before setting the village on fire. According to the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum, the dead included men, women, and children, among them refugees who had fled other parts of France. What remains today is not simply a French memorial. It has become one of the most powerful symbols in Europe of what occupation, reprisal, and ideological violence can do to civilians in a single afternoon. And that is why Oradour belongs in a film like this, even among volcanic lakes, deserts, caves, and waterfalls, because the world can become strange in more than one way. Sometimes through erosion, sometimes through fire, and sometimes because human beings can do something so absolute that the landscape itself is changed forever. Oradour-sur-Glane is not mysterious because we do not know what happened there. It is haunting because we do. Lake Kaindy, the forest that never left. After Oradour, where memory remained in stone and ash, Lake Kaindy gives us a different kind of silence. In southeastern Kazakhstan, within Kolsai Lakes National Park in the Tian Shan region, there is a mountain lake that looks at first glance almost serene. The water is clear, blue-green, and still. The surrounding slopes are covered with coniferous forest. But rising out of the lake are pale, bare tree trunks, as if an entire woodland had been caught mid-breath and never allowed to leave. Kazakhstan's official tourism materials describe Lake Kaindy as a unique sunken forest, and the park's own materials place it within a protected landscape known for its mountain ecology and stands of Schrenks spruce. What makes the lake so extraordinary is that it is relatively young. Official Kazakhstan sources say it was created after the 1911 Kabin earthquake triggered a massive landslide that blocked the gorge and formed a natural dam. Water gradually filled the valley, and in doing so, it drowned the conifer forest that had once stood there. So this is not an ancient lake in the usual sense. It is more like a geological interruption, an accident of stone, gravity, and time that turned a living forest into a submerged memorial. And that is why the place stays with people. The trunks still rise above the surface, stripped and weathered, while the colder water below helped preserve much of what remained underwater. Kazakhstan's government tourism descriptions note that the lake can shift in color from emerald to deep blue, and that the water stays strikingly cold. Seen from a distance, the trees look less like trees than like the masts of sunken ships. Seen up close, they feel even stranger, because you realize you are not looking at driftwood or ruin, but at a forest that was never fully erased. For an American audience, the image is almost immediately legible. It feels like nature created its own ghost story, not with legends, not with monsters, just with water, cold, and sudden change. Lake Kaindy is beautiful, yes, but its beauty is not soft. It carries the feeling of something interrupted and preserved at the same time. A place where the past did not sink out of sight. It remained visible, standing upright, just below and above the surface. So after a village history refused to abandon, we arrive at a lake that geology refused to smooth over. And in Kazakhstan, that refusal became one of the most haunting landscapes on Earth. Mount Kelimutu, the lakes that never keep their promise. Some landscapes do not feel fixed. They feel as if they are still thinking. On the island of Flores in Indonesia, Mount Kelimutu rises to about 469 meters, and at its summit sit three crater lakes so unusual that they have become the mountain's entire identity. They are not remarkable simply because they are beautiful. They are remarkable because they do not stay the same. On official Kelimutu National Park materials, the lakes are described as changing between green, blue, black, and red, and the volcano monitoring records of the Smithsonian's Global Volcanism Program likewise note that the three summit lakes vary in color over time, rather than holding to a single permanent hue. That alone would be enough to make Kelimutu memorable. But what gives it real depth is the fact that the three lakes are not just geological features to the people who live nearby. In the traditions of the Layo community, the lakes are tied to the dead. The western lake, Tiwu Ata Mupu, is associated with the souls of the old. Tiwu Nua Muri Ku Fai is linked with the souls of the young, and Tiwu Ata Polo is connected with those believed to have carried darker moral weight in life. Kelimutu National Park's official site says directly that local people regard the lakes as a resting place for ancestral spirits, and that cultural traditions around those beliefs are still respected and preserved. That changes the atmosphere of the place completely, because once you know that, Kelimutu stops feeling like a natural curiosity and starts feeling like a sacred threshold. The colors are no longer just colors. They begin to feel like signs, unstable, unreadable, maybe even personal. Official park materials note that many local residents have long interpreted major color changes as meaningful, sometimes even as warnings connected to misfortune or upheaval. Whether one shares that belief or not, it reveals something important. This mountain is not only observed here, it is listened to. Science, of course, tells another part of the story. The lakes change because the volcano beneath them is still active in subtle ways. Kelimutu National Park explains the shifts as the result of volcanic gases rising and reacting with the water, while a 2017 study using roughly 30 years of Landsat data found that the lake's colors and temperatures change through time in relation to volcanic hydrothermal activity. The chemistry is complex, but the essential truth is simple. These lakes are alive to what is happening below them. They are not painted, they are reacting. And that is why Kelimutu leaves such a strong impression on screen. Lake Kaindy felt like a landscape interrupted. Kelimutu feels like a landscape still in conversation with itself. Nothing here looks violent in the obvious sense. There is no crashing waterfall, no collapsing cliff, no visible eruption. And yet the place carries a quiet instability, a sense that the mountain is expressing something in a language made of mineral, vapor, water, and time. Even the park's cultural materials reflect that closeness between geology and ritual. The annual Patika ceremony, held on August 14th, remains tied to the lakes and to ancestral remembrance. So if Angel Falls felt like the sky breaking open and Ellora felt like a mountain carved by devotion, Kelimutu gives us something more elusive, a summit where nature changes its face without warning. A sacred place where the dead are believed to linger, and 3 lakes that never seem entirely finished becoming what they are. Dargavs, the town built for the dead. High in the mountains of North Ossetia, Alania, there is a hillside that from a distance can look almost peaceful. Small, pale stone structures rise one after another against the slope, arranged with the quiet order of a village. But Dargavs is not a village in the ordinary sense. It is a necropolis known as the City of the Dead, a burial complex that UNESCO's comparative materials describe as consisting of 95 crypt structures dating from the 14th century to the first third of the 19th century. These were not isolated graves scattered across a field. They were family crypts, built in forms that make the dead appear to live together, house by house above the valley. That is what makes Dargavs so visually unsettling. The crypts do not resemble tombs in the way many American viewers might expect. They resemble dwellings. UNESCO's description notes 2 main types: semi-underground crypts and tower-type crypts, built of roughly worked stone with lime mortar, some with gabled or hipped roofs rising toward a conical top. Seen together on the mountainside, they create the impression not of a cemetery we visit, but of a settlement we are not meant to join. And the site carries more than architecture. It carries a worldview. The University of Pennsylvania's Russian and East European Studies program notes that local Ossetian tradition remembers people being buried there with clothes and belongings, and that the necropolis is still seen as a way of understanding how people in the region lived centuries ago. UNESCO's materials add that the tombs have yielded preserved clothing, household objects, glassware, jewelry, tools, food remains, and other items that help reconstruct the material life of the 14th-18th century North Caucasus. In other words, Dargavs is not only about death, it is also about continuity, about how a culture carried memory forward through burial itself. Like many places where grief and landscape meet, Dargavs also drew legends to itself. Penn's account records a local belief that those who entered the City of the Dead would never return alive, and mentions a custom involving a coin well in front of each crypt. If a tossed coin struck stone below, It was taken as a sign of safe passage to heaven. Other stories connect the necropolis to plague. A Radio Free Europe/Radio Liberty report on local lore notes long-standing legends linking the site to epidemic outbreaks, while Penn recounts traditions about quarantine houses and the sick waiting there at the end of life. Whether every detail of those stories can be historically verified or not, they reveal something important. To local memory, Dargavs was never just a burial ground. It was a threshold. That is the tone this place demands. Not horror, not sensationalism, something quieter than that. Because Dargavs is not frightening simply because it is filled with the dead. It is haunting because it was built with such care for them. After Kelimutu, where the mountains seem to hold a conversation with the spirit world, Dargavs feels like another kind of sacred landscape, one where the dead were not pushed away from the living, but given their own architecture, their own slope, their own enduring place above the valley. And in that silence, the city of the dead becomes something unexpectedly human, a town of absence, still standing. Houtouwan, the village the hillside took back. After Dargavs, where the dead were given their own place on the mountain, Houtouwan gives us another kind of settlement shaped by absence. On Shengshan Island, in the Shengsi archipelago east of Shanghai, Houtouwan was once a working fishing village, home to thousands of residents during its most active years. National Geographic describes it as a former fishing community on a steep island in the East China Sea, while more recent regional reporting says the village grew from the 1950s onward and at its peak held more than 3,000 people. What makes Houtouwan so arresting is that it does not look destroyed. It looks absorbed. The houses are still there. The lanes are still there. The outlines of ordinary life remain visible. But the walls are wrapped in vines, roofs are softened by grass, and whole facades seem to be dissolving into the hillside. National Geographic describes abandoned homes on the slope, with walls collapsing, roofs caving in, and local plants overtaking the structures, while recent reporting from Zhejiang presents the village as a place remade by dense creepers and sea-facing greenery into something almost fairy tale-like. And that visual beauty can be misleading, because Houtouwan was not abandoned for romantic reasons. It faded because modern life moved faster than the village could. National Geographic says the fishing community struggled to keep up with growing competition linked to nearby Shanghai, and regional accounts add that depleting marine resources and inconvenient transportation pushed families to leave through the 1990s. By the early 2000s, the village had effectively emptied out. That is what gives the place its emotional weight for an American audience. Houtouwan does not feel like a disaster zone. It feels like a place that simply lost its argument with geography and economics. Too remote, too hard to supply, too difficult to connect to the future that was arriving elsewhere. So people left. And once they left, nature did not rush in violently. It returned patiently, a wall at a time. A roofline at a time, a stairway at a time. By the mid-2010s, photographs of the overgrown village began circulating widely online, and Houtouwan's afterlife had begun. Condé Nast Traveller notes that images of the village went viral in 2015, after which visitor infrastructure followed, including a viewing platform in 2017 and hiking routes for tourists. In other words, the village did not come back to life as a fishing port. It came back as an image one people could not stop looking at. And maybe that is why Houtouwan stays with people. Not because it is the saddest abandoned place, not because it is the oldest, but because it shows, with unusual clarity, what happens when human presence fades and the landscape is finally allowed to continue the sentence on its own. In Dargavs, memory was preserved in stone. In Houtouwan, memory is being covered in green, slowly, gently, almost beautifully, until the village looks less like something forgotten than something the earth has decided to keep for itself. Kandovan, the village that stayed inside the mountain. Houtouwan was a village the hillside reclaimed. Kandovan is the opposite. In northwestern Iran, in East Azerbaijan province near Tabriz, Kandovan still lives inside the rock. Academic work on Iranian underground dwellings describes it as a man-made cliff settlement that remains inhabited, set at the foothills of Mount Sahand, where homes were cut directly into volcanic stone rather than built in the usual way. What makes Kandovan so striking is that the village seems half geological, half human. The cone-shaped formations, locally called karan, were created from volcanic material associated with Sahand, then slowly shaped by erosion over time. Engineering geology research describes the houses as being carved into pyroclastic rocks and ignimbrite formed from Sahand's volcanic activity, while another architectural study explains that water erosion gradually separated the cones and even helped create the passages that later became the village streets. And once people moved into those cones, they did not simply use them as shelter, they turned them into architecture. The dwellings developed in multiple levels, with lower spaces often used for animals and upper levels for daily life. Some rise 3 or even 4 levels, and the rock itself helps regulate the interior climate, keeping the spaces warm in winter and cool in summer. That matters because Kandovan is not impressive only as a curiosity. It is impressive as proof that an ancient form of living can still be practical. There is also a historical undercurrent here. One scholarly survey says the first inhabitants were probably people from nearby Ellora who fled to this area during the Mongol invasions in the 13th century, then stayed permanently once they realized the cone-shaped rock offered both protection and a workable place to live. That word matters, protection. Kandovan was not originally built as spectacle, it was built as refuge. And maybe that is why the village still feels so intimate. It was carved out of necessity before it ever became something to admire. For an American audience, the closest instinct might be to compare it to places like Cappadocia or the cliff dwellings of the American Southwest. But Kandovan has a different emotional register, because this is not a fossil of human presence. It is a continuation of it. The mountain was not abandoned. It was domesticated patiently, room by room. And in 2023, UN Tourism included Kandovan among its best tourism villages, a sign that the place is now recognized not just for looking extraordinary, but for preserving a living rural culture inside an ancient landscape. So after Houtouwan, where nature covered the walls and silence took over, Kandovan gives us another answer to the same question. What happens when people live in a place that should have been temporary? Sometimes they leave, and sometimes, as they did here in Iran, they carve the refuge deeper, raise families inside it, and stay long enough for the mountain itself to begin feeling like home.